So thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar. My name is Anja Padget. I work at Delogue as head of ESG and Communication, and I'm really pleased to be here today with my guest from Vaayu, who will get to introduce herself in a bit. So this webinar is we're going to dive into product environmental impact, which is I know is something that really is something that is a lot on everybody's minds out there. So I think it's going to be really interesting to dive a bit into this topic together with my guest today. So first of all, let's just briefly get started. There we go. So I will be presenting a bit, and my guest will present herself, and then we'll run through some slides with questions along the way that I have prepared. And I will just briefly ask some questions, and then you're always welcome to also ask questions in the Q&A. I will keep track of the questions during the presentation. So either I will ask them in the end, or if it fits in when we are at the specific slide, I'll of course just ask the questions at that time. So just shoot your questions into the Q&A runningly. But first of all, let's just start by presenting my guest today. Namrata, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Anya, and super excited to be here this morning. I'm Nam. I'm one of the founders of Vaayu, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we do through the entire webinar. But essentially, at Vaayu, my background is in sustainability, and we came in to really help brands and retailers to be able to understand the data and understand their footprint and their environmental impact, and really think about where they can optimize, how they can lower their impact, and of course, meet regulatory and compliance requirements, but essentially really to help enable some of that optimization of products, of packaging, of logistics, sort of the key levers that brands and retailers have. So very happy to be here.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nam. Okay, so let's dive into the specific topics today. I want to briefly just set the scene. I think if you've joined one of our webinars before, you have seen these pictures many times, because this is sort of the picture of where we started off. I think many of us are really being hit by all of the legislation coming our way that were set by a bunch of people sitting around in this very big room. They then came up with this strategy back in 2022, sustainable and circular textile strategy by 2030. Now, in that strategy was mentioned a whole lot of different initiatives and goals for circular textiles to basically change the way that we work in the fashion industry. And of course, all of these, or this big strategy had the impact of where we are sort of seeing the brands having their struggles today and what they're trying to figure out and trying to grasp all of these different abbreviations and words that are in some cases very new to the fashion industry. It's a very new way of working, a very new data-oriented way of working. And that's something that many of our customers, and I assume many of my customers as well, are very much trying to figure out and being hit by this, trying to gather all of the data, necessary data, to be able to be compliant. So we'll dive into that as well in a bit. So first of all, if we just start off by having a bit of question from Nam, if you could just start by giving us this overview of the key regulations that brands should be paying attention to.
Sure. Thanks, Anya. So we know, as you said, there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of different regulations, especially hitting the fashion industry. And I think there's been a lot of noise and a lot of chat around CSRD and CSDDD with Omnibus and the rollback of some of these regulations and what that really means for brands, and if it's still enough regulation and compliance in the space that people need to kind of work towards. So at the things from a product level haven't really changed as much as people think, especially when it comes to fashion. So specifically in France, there's the environmental cost or the eco score that came into effect as of October. So if people trade specifically in France and within certain limits. There's the eco score, which means showing at a product level the scoring that the French government has set up. So if brands are trading there, that's super important that they look into that a little bit more. We had another webinar, we specifically looked at that and have some tools. And if people have questions, we're happy to send those over in terms of whether they need to comply with the eco score. Then there's, I think you mentioned briefly, the ESPR and the Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation. That's another one with the DPPs that there's a lot of chat about and people speaking a lot about. That is expected to come in a couple of years. And with that, what that essentially means is you need to understand and be able to trace your supply chain, have good quality data, and really understand where your products are coming from. So that's an important one that comes in, especially when we know it takes quite a bit of time to get high resolution and high fidelity data. So as it takes a few years to get to that level in the supply chain, that's something that businesses should really start to think about, because we expect that to come in the next couple of years. And then there's the EPR for apparel and footwear, which is the EU's Waste Framework Directive, which means in the next few years, we expect that within the ESPR, people will need to disclose the recycled content, the materials, the durability, possibly even penalties for fast fashion. So really understanding from a material perspective and what implications your product has from a waste perspective. So if you think about it quite holistically across all of these, there's quite a bit of regulations, but they really touch product and really understanding your supply chain.
Exactly. Many of them are very much related to the fact that the first thing you said about having a lot more data than they're used to having, and of course the traceability of their supply chain, right? If they're
Yes.
very much co-linking with each other, that's definitely what we see right now.
Exactly. And I think the data quality, and I think there's a lot of chat around kind of what quality of data you need to be able to have. And I think there's a lot of iteration that will come through. And I think that's something we'll talk about over the
Yeah.
next few minutes as well, I assume.
I think also in terms of the DPP, I think there is also a bit of uncertainty on when we're going to be able to see these delegated acts. Many are waiting. Can you give an update on where we are in the DPP?
So I think there's been some chat in terms of the timeline, and that's been pushed back to 2027. And I think there's been a couple times it's been pushed back. So I think people are unsure of whether it's going to come. We still expect it to come. We just don't have a definitive date. And as I said, that one is quite dense in terms of the data that you need to be able to disclose. So even if it isn't in place yet, it's something that brands should start working towards and kind of have a DPP checklist and seeing how much of that data they can already gather and how much more they need to work on.
Exactly, exactly. And touching upon that in terms of sort of we know that they are feeling overwhelmed out there, the brands really trying to grasp what does it all mean, all of this. Any advice for focus on what's actually important today in terms of preparing for the year? So in highlights on what how should they prepare?
Think, as I briefly touched on, I think one of the things that whether there's a rollback of some of the laws, whether some come through, I think the thread generally across all of it is the data, and the quality of data needs to improve over time. So I think the advice we've been giving brand partners over the last couple of years is always, whether you're complying with a specific regulation or not, what they're all asking you, as we've said, is understand your products better, understand your supply chain better, and that no matter which laws come through, you're going to have to do. So I think one of the things we say in terms of starting or thinking about it is, how much do I know about my product? What all do I know about it? And where do I need to know more? And kind of starting with the checklist approach, which is saying, this is what the status quo is, this is where I'm at. These are the laws that I would be able to comply with right now. And then if I had to improve that over time, which laws would I prioritize and which data gathering? So it's really a data exercise of really trying to understand where are the data gaps for your business and where you should really focus.
Exactly. All right. Having said that, next slide up. Sort of looking at this, where to start. We get that question a lot as well from our customers. Where do we start? Because we say a lot of data. What does that then mean in terms of, let's go a bit more practical. So for brands with, some of them also have quite limited internal resources. When we talk about this, they don't necessarily have a whole team that are ready to just gather all of these different things. What's a sort of realistic way to get started with, in example, when you get to the product impact calculation, when we talk about using bio and so on, where do they, what's a realistic way of starting when we want to do this?
Yeah, and I think people assume that There is a need for very, very large teams to get started and people who are dedicated to doing this. And the way the data sits in most brands is essentially across different teams. So one of the first things to focus on is how do you get the different people in the business involved who own some of that data and are kind of responsible for that, even if you don't have a big team in place. So essentially, who are the key people within the teams, whether that's designers or buying teams that have some of the product level data, like how do you engage them? And I think one of the ways to do that, if you don't have a big team, is to work with management or senior teams and say, can we get a dedicated working group with certain people from certain parts of the business to really be able to get people in place who work with that data on a daily basis? So that's one of the things I think that if you don't have a big team is an easier way to start to manage that. And as I said, the most basic thing to do is to look at what do we already have. What
Mm.
data sits where? Do the data mapping exercise? Which systems does it sit in? How do we collect that? How complex is it? Is it all in Excel sheets? Trying to really break down and understand where that data sits and where are those gaps and how over time you start to fill those. And I think having kind of a trajectory to this year we'd like to incrementally get this data and next year we'd like to get this, and having a kind of roadmap on where you want to collect and how you want to collect that data is super important.
Exactly. And touching upon that, I think it's quite important to also look into, we know that data, it sort of gives itself away that it has something to do with technology. So how do you think technology and platforms like Vaayu simplify this work? How can we sort of help as technologies to simplify the work?
Yeah, and there, if you have, that's kind of one of the big pieces that we do is essentially if you don't have a large team and you need to crunch, then once you've collected all of this data and you've got all of this large volume of data, what do you do next with it? And that's where I think you can lean into softwares and other solutions which basically have the expertise. So you then don't need to get into now, how do I, in a granular way, understand how to calculate, but rather we think sustainability teams should be focused on working with their stakeholders to improve, to get better data, to work on better quality data, and then working with their stakeholders once it's processed to really understand how to optimize, how to reduce, how to lower, how to comply. So essentially, that's really where we see the skills of the sustainability team. And what we're coming in to do is kind of how do we enable those processes? How do we make it easier? So how do we connect to systems like Delogue or other platforms? How do we then create data quality that brands can then work with essentially to be able to do those two major things, which is optimization and reduction and meeting regulatory requirements? And that software, I think, plays a really big role there.
Yeah, and I think looking at the middle in the slide now in terms of suppliers, right? It's also about looking into how can you work with the suppliers when we think about gathering data, they are a huge part of that work, right?
Exactly. And how do you engage them in the process? And how do you enable them to be able to give you good quality data without having to float around 50,000 emails and attachments and things? And how do you use technology to really optimize that process? Because that we know working with supply chains can be complex, people all over the world using different languages. So kind of technology is a big piece there in being able to collect some of that supply chain data, which over time more and more is needed, as we said, for DPPs and other regulatory requirements as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Taking the next slide, like diving a bit further down, I think, because I think looking at, we've now sort of said the importance of collecting all of the data. What are the initiatives that probably needs to be done to be able to collect all of the data? But let's have a look at what data then needs to be collected. So what are the most important data points that brands should focus on collecting first?
Sure, and I should start by saying I'm in no way going to give a comprehensive list right now and like really preface that to say that this is in no way complete. But I think what you really need to focus on are what are the biggest levers and what are the things that the footprint really comes from. And that's really the data that you need to focus on. So whether that's with the software, whether that's with the manual exercise of really thinking through what is the data we really need to have. I mean, the most obvious is materials, material composition, breakdown of the product. Country of origin sounds easy, but I think in some cases, based on systems, sometimes that's actually quite hard to get for people. So country of origin is a really important one. And then as you go down each tier, based on the product category you work with, based on if you work with a lot of trims, trim data becomes important. If you work in different, like a t-shirt, then where your cotton comes from would become important. So I think it also depends a lot. And I think as part of that kind of understanding your product, it's important to understand what are the biggest levers within your product that are going to kind of influence your footprint. Because when we think about regulation, whether we think about compliance and traceability or we think about product footprint, it's always going to matter what kind of is the product you're actually working with. So I think for your product, key product categories, kind of coming up with a frame of these are the key data points. And as I said, it varies based on product category. And usually material and material origin is kind of the next piece. So country of origin of the product and where it's produced. And following that, if you can get where the materials come from, that's a big piece you need to be able to get. And then if you worked with denim, where they're washed, how they're washed, the processes. So based on category level, it starts to become important to map exactly that within
Yeah.
your product.
Yeah, so sort of understanding the production process of a product, and what does that then how does that then impact on environmental, right?
Exactly. And also, when you think about traceability or DPPs or kind of supply chain, you're going to have to go down tier by tier. So, the most obvious way to do that is let's get all of our tier one, let's then go to tier two, let's then go to tier three. And how do you do that in a kind of synchronous order to be able to get visibility, to be able to put that on a DPP? And when you do that, then it becomes okay, now if you're getting that visibility over time, how do you turn that visibility into data? So how do you then ask those supply chain partners for more data as well?
Nice. And do you think so looking at collecting all of this data, but when do you say to the brands, when you say when you start up a brand partner and you say sort of we have to you need to start collecting all of this data because we need all of this data. Is there a certain point in time? We talk a lot about with our customers as well, that they sort of ask us when, we do it in the beginning? Do we do it in the end when we place the order? How do you think, where does that make sense for you to sort of put it in the process of how they're working today? Because I think it sort of feels like for them that, okay, so now we have to collect a loads of data. When do we do it in the smartest way in our process working?
Yeah. And I think maybe two different things to say there. Maybe on one hand, I know it sounds, and we've talked a lot about data and we've talked a lot about how far into the data you need to go, and this starts to get very scary very quickly. So maybe just to say this is very much an iterative process, and whatever data you've got, you need to start working with that. So maybe as a baseline to say, I know that a lot of people on this webinar might not have a lot of the data that we've mentioned in terms of tiers and going down the supply chain. I think the starting point is material composition, country of origin, sort of the basic product level data. And I think it's important to say that's enough to get started. So you don't need all of this data to get started. So I think that's one important thing to say. So it's an iterative process. And then I think to your point, I think there's two different parts to that. One is how much are you using this data to influence product decisions?
Mhm.
So how much is it about designing better and optimizing products? And then it becomes, it needs to be before you place an order, you're looking at some of this data. And I think the second is kind of, is it regulatory compliance and kind of what's the motivation? And then even if you're doing it, this is all the products that we've placed on market. These are all the products that we've produced. Then after that process, it works. So I think as a brand, also making a decision in terms of what are we trying to do and what are we trying to achieve, and whether that's designing better products or both, then how that data collection is looks a little bit different.
Exactly, exactly. Very interesting. I think that really fills up a lot of the day for many of our customers as well, is sort of when do we do it? How much do we do it? It's just, it sort of becomes a bit of a black hole for them. So that's really interesting. Okay, taking the next slide. I wanted to sort of just look ahead a bit because I think um, there's one thing to do it now. There's one thing when, especially when the legislation's coming our way and so on, in terms of the DPP, how much of these calculations, impact calculations, will be needed and so on. How do you think it's going to evolve during, not only with the legislation, but also in terms of requirements from bigger accounts and so on that want to know all of this information for their reporting requirements and so on? Where do you see sort of it evolving, and perhaps also a bit of how has it evolved until now? Because I think it is an evolvement in terms of impact calculations. How do you see the future in this?
Sure. And I think, as you said, it's already been a big evolution. My background was in
Exactly.
sustainability. So I was at Zalando before I started the company, and what world we were living in then looks quite different from kind of what we're seeing now. And you will see brand partners, like if you sell into some of the bigger retailers, that there will be requirements coming through from them, quite extensive format and different formats as well from different kind of retailers saying, fill this out. We hear that a lot, that a lot of different formats are coming through. So I think as an industry, there has been a lot of progression and a lot of evolution. So I think we'll continue to see that. So I think we'll see the movement from just compliance to, as we talked about, now being about optimization. But I think we'll see the movement that that will become the status quo over a period of time, where the expectation will be maybe we start to see more product footprints if those get integrated into the DPPs. If that gets integrated into DPPs, you'll start to see product footprint on product as kind of mandatory and something everyone has to do. And if we see that, then people will start becoming aware, exactly like they have on beauty and skincare, where you look at the rating and you're like, I won't buy, or food when you look at the rating. So I think you'll start to see that over time come through as well. So people will start making decisions based on, well, if I'm buying a t-shirt from two different brands and the footprints look really different, and I see it on both, then I'll maybe pick the one that's lower if I'm torn between one and the other. So I think we'll see customers and decision making also evolve over time, and we'll see, definitely we've seen regulation come through quite rapidly compared to some of the other industries, in terms of like the last 5 years from a landscape perspective have completely changed, and I think we keep expecting that to come through. So 20 from 2020 to 25, we've seen a very large amount of regulation come through. And I think a lot of that will be implemented in the next couple of years. And we expect to see similar scale of regulation coming through from 25 to 2030 as well. So I think also the evolution of regulation will come in. And so both with the kind of consumer facing piece and the evolution of regulation, and then retailers having requirements, I think we'll see more and more around kind of calculating data quality, showing to customers on site in experience coming through a lot more.
Yeah, and I think those three pillars of sort of future expectations really tap into the fact that this is not only a sort of compliance a task. It's much more of a operational excellence. It's sort of it sort of emphasizes the fact that this is the part of the business. It's the part of survival of your business, that if all of these are impacted, especially if you draw it out to a customer perspective, that this will impact their way of buying. This suddenly becomes something that is something for them to stay operational, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we will see also technology play a huge role in this. I think the technology, from a perspective of automation, of kind of course, buying and software there, because you'll need good quality data. So I think we'll see that. But we'll also see on the software side, on the calculation side, because the scale and the quantity of data that will need to get processed over time. So I think we'll see technology play a really large role in being able to deliver some of this for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And if we look at sort of the supplier perspective, just for a bit, I think I would like to just ask you if you think that, all of these regulations and changes that are happening and have happened, do you think it will sort of change the way that we're working with suppliers? Do you think sort of, you also mentioned a bit about the design process changing in terms of product development. Do you see that changing in terms of working with our suppliers? I think that's something that's also quite dear to my heart, that we need to have the suppliers on board here. But do you see it changing when we have all of these things hitting the industry?
I think what we might see changing more than kind of how we work with suppliers is, one, kind of the expectation of one, data from them. But I
Mhm.
think second, on nominating specific things. So I think in historically, a lot of times suppliers come with kind of their optionality, which materials they have, what they have in stock, whatever that looks like. And I think if we see some of the waste regulation come through, I think because there will be potentially fines or penalties linked to which materials you use, I think there will be a shift maybe towards more, we nominate or we decide these materials and these are the ones that have to be used in these products, because otherwise there'll be financial implications for us. So I think on the material and the kind of selection level, we might see the way that relationship is changed. And I think maybe less chopping and changing suppliers, also because you need so much data from them, because you need to have longer relationships to be able to cultivate that, which is a good thing. I think we might see how long those relationships last and the quality of those relationships maybe change over time as well.
Completely agree. I think it's actually maybe 1.5 years ago, I had an interview with the previous sustainability manager at Bjørk Christensen, it was, and she said exactly the same thing, that we're sort of done with this supplied by supplier, locally sourced, and so on. We're going to have to need to know where things are coming from, and that probably will impact that we will begin to nominate more than just being reliant on the suppliers finding it for us. Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's definitely something that we'll see and are already seeing, I feel. Final question. I do have one question, but I'll take that afterwards from the Q&A. Remember, you can just write your questions for the ones watching. Final question to you, Nam, is what's your best advice for brands wanting to stay ahead rather than chasing the rule? I think that's really something that many are they hesitant? Are they, I don't know, but there are many that are sort of chasing it, and then it'll become putting out a fire because now the fire has started. Advice for the ones that want to stay ahead?
Yeah, and I think similar to, I think financial reporting is a kind of nice way to think about sustainability reporting and sustainability data in some ways as an infrastructure piece rather than as an additional add-on piece. And exactly like financial data improves, KPIs improve year on year, really thinking about sustainability and data in the same way. So it's kind of an infrastructural piece for the business. It's something that you really need to get good at, you need to get better at, you need to improve. So I think keeping that baseline in mind is important. And we've talked a lot about the amount and quantity of regulations coming in, but they all have very similar threads and they all have very similar requirements that kind of overlap. So I think it's important to start with some kind of mapping of that and really being clear what you need to do, because as you said, otherwise you become super reactive to, oh no, this is coming in, this is now, and we need to disclose next year, we don't have this data. And rather than having kind of a strategic view of how you do that as a business, you end up consistently just chasing data points. And I think that doesn't then allow you to be strategic also about how you improve, how you optimize, how you get better at creating better products. So I think being strategic there is super important. And yes, there are regulations coming through. Yes, there are loads of them, but they're all kind of massively overlapping in terms of what they're asking you to do. So really focus on those kind of key pieces rather than getting lost in trying to focus on, I don't know, 20 different regulations as one at once. And then also we have a free regulation tracker and we can send that through after, which maybe is helpful for some of the brands to really understand and break down some of these regulations and whether they need to comply with them or not.
Definitely. I think let's we'll send that out when we send the recording and the presentation. We can send that out as well for everybody watching here. And yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Nam. We are coming to the end of our time today. I do have one question, which is very much directed at Delogue, which is perfectly fine. The question is if Delogue is implementing the functionality so that suppliers can update and manage bill of materials directly for sort of small organizations helping. I have to say that this is not a new question for us. We're getting this question quite a lot, actually, also from the very big ones, that suppliers are playing a huge role in adding this data, adding the different things, not necessarily directly to a bill of material, because we still see that as being sort of owned by the brand, but being able for suppliers to enrich the data needed for doing the calculations through Vaayu or wherever else, or doing anything else with it, supply chain mapping and so on. So we're definitely very well aware of that. And next year we will be looking into sort of switching it a bit around so that suppliers have much more to say in our platform. So stay tuned for that. We're very much aware of the fact that we need the suppliers to help us with all of this data, and we need to help them in a way that it doesn't become too much of a burden on them and us. So very much aware of this. Good. I would just like to briefly, as an ending, we've already done the Q&A. Any final questions, quickly write them. Otherwise, we note them down and we'll get you the reply afterwards. Just quickly with a Q&A, not a Q&A, next webinar we will have in December. For this webinar, I have asked our leadership, our CTO, CPO, and CEO to join me in looking back at Delogue's 2025. And of course, what's to come in 2026. So please sign up for that if you want to know more about sort of our progress this year, but especially, of course, what we're focusing on next year. And finally, wanting to just do a bit of publicity for our big event coming next year. We had it this year as well. Big success. We're going to have it next year as well, 12th of May, inviting all of the tech partners to join us for this day and all of the brands to come and listen to, inspired by the brands, inspired by the tech solutions. It's a great day to meet each other, communicate, connect, and yeah, be better together. So if you want to sign up for that, go to our website and check that out. Now, thank you so much, Nam, for joining me today. It was such a pleasure. Really a good conversation. If any questions or anything afterwards, just let us know, and we'll be sending out the recording and the presentation, and we'll send out as well from Vaayu. Yeah. So we'll send that out shortly after this. Thank you so much, Nam. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Anja.
Have a good day, everyone.